Supermax, the psychological collapse no one talks about inside the mind-breaking isolation cells. They call it clean torture. No bruises, no broken bones. Yet every expert who has studied it agrees. The human mind is not built to survive what happens inside a Supermax isolation cell. And the most disturbing part? The damage doesn't start after months, it starts within days. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Across the United States, thousands of people live in near total isolation, a concrete room roughly the size of a parking space. 23 hours a day. No meaningful human contact. Minimal sound. Minimal light. No social cues. No real-time markers. No normal sensory input. Psychologists from the American Psychological Association, researchers like Dr. Craig Haney, reports from the National Institute of Justice, and investigations by the Vera Institute of Justice have spent decades studying what this kind of confinement does to the brain. Their findings consistently point to one conclusion. Long-term Supermax isolation is a direct attack on the psychological systems that make us human. Today, we go inside that invisible world through documented research, credible case studies, and real inmate patterns observed in verified correctional reports. This is not about sensationalism. This is about the hidden mechanics of a place designed not just to confine the body, but to unmake the mind. The first 72 hours, where the mind begins to fracture. Researchers often describe the first 72 hours in a Supermax cell as the cognitive freefall, not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing happens. The NJ reports that the brain responds to extreme isolation the same way it responds to sensory deprivation experiments. It begins to search for patterns that aren't there. Dr. Haney documented this repeatedly while interviewing individuals who had spent time in Supermax segregation. Most described the same early symptoms: restlessness, memory slips, distorted time awareness, and a growing sense that their thoughts were becoming louder in their own head. One case example that appears across multiple academic interviews involves a man, identified only in reports as R, who arrived in long-term segregation for a nonviolent infraction. Within days, he described the room as shrinking. He later clarified that the cell wasn't literally getting smaller. It just felt like it was pressing inward, inch by inch, as if the air inside had weight. This sensation is widely reported in solitary confinement studies, a psychological compression caused by sensory monotony. Another documented pattern involves inmates pacing in perfect squares, 20 steps forward, 20 steps back for hours. The APA notes this behavior as the brain's attempt to regulate stress hormones when no external stimulation exists. One individual interviewed in a research study said the pacing wasn't a choice. It was the only way to keep my thoughts from echoing. Inside these walls, sounds take on new meaning. A distant door slam becomes a landmark, a reminder that something exists outside the cell. Footsteps in the corridor feel like evidence of other human beings who are close, yet unreachable. According to Vera Institute findings, the absence of social connection activates the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. Think about that. The brain experiences extreme loneliness as if it were injury. For one incarcerated man cited in a Chicago crime lab review, the silence became so complete that he began whispering random words just to hear a human voice, his own. If I stopped talking, he said, I didn't feel real. These experiences are not rare. They're not exaggerations. They are common, documented reactions to isolation across thousands of interviews, evaluations, and psychological assessments conducted over decades. And in a Supermax environment, this is only the beginning. When the environment doesn't change, the mind does. When the walls start talking back, by the second week in isolation, the brain begins adapting in ways that researchers have compared to forced rewiring. Not because the person is unstable, but because the environment leaves the mind with no other choice. The American Psychological Association notes that human cognition depends heavily on social feedback. Facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. These cues anchor our thoughts in reality. Remove them long enough, and the brain begins manufacturing its own. In multiple NIJ and Vera Institute interviews, individuals in Supermax units described an eerie shift. The silence starts to feel alive. One man, identified only as T, said he began hearing patterns in the hum of the ventilation system. Not voices, not hallucinations, but rhythms that felt intentional, like coded messages he needed to decipher. Researchers emphasize that this is not losing touch with reality in a Hollywood sense. It's the mind searching for stimulation when none exists. A natural cognitive response to unnatural conditions. Another widely documented experience is the phenomenon of thought looping. Dr. Craig Haney observed this repeatedly. Individuals replaying the same memory, scenario, or imagined conversation for hours, sometimes days. Without new sensory input, the mind recycles old material, replaying it until it distorts. One man in a California Supermax unit reported that he could hear arguments from his past, not as hallucinations, but as vivid internal reenactments so detailed they felt present. He described it in academic interviews as being trapped in an echo chamber of your own regrets. In a Chicago crime lab review, an individual explained that he began knocking lightly on the wall, not to communicate, but to create a reminder that physical reality still existed. If I didn't make sound, he said, I felt like I was dissolving. Across verified case studies, these symptoms aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of a brain under extreme environmental stress. The human mind is built for connection, built for stimulation, built for meaning. Inside a Supermax cell, it is forced to survive without all three. This is the stage where psychologists say the mind begins shifting from coping to deteriorating. And for many people in long-term isolation, what comes next is far more dangerous than the silence. When identity starts to unravel, by the time weeks turn into months, Supermax isolation begins attacking something deeper than mood, memory, or perception. According to decades of research from the APA, NIJ, and leading scholars like Dr. Craig Haney, the most severe consequence of long-term solitary confinement is the gradual erosion of personal identity. Identity, who we believe we are, is shaped through interaction. We understand ourselves by how others respond to us. Remove those responses completely, and the sense of self becomes unstable. One man, interviewed anonymously for a Vera Institute study, described it this way. When no one looks at you, it's like you stop existing in their world. And then it hits you. You're starting to disappear from yours too. Psychologists call this self-concept disintegration. Inmates often just call it fading. The mirror problem, a phenomenon documented in multiple correctional mental health reports, is the breakdown of self-recognition. Not hallucinations, but the unsettling feeling that the person in the mirror looks unfamiliar. In one case study included in NIJ-reviewed evaluations, an individual said he didn't recognize the expression on his own face. Not because it changed, but because isolation had stripped away the emotional interactions needed to interpret it. He still knew it was him. He just didn't feel like him. The personality shift. Dr. Haney notes that extended isolation produces profound personality changes. Increased hypersensitivity to sound. Heightened anxiety. Emotional flattening. Difficulty controlling impulses. Trouble distinguishing internal thoughts from external cues. These are not inherent traits. They're environmental consequences. One man in a Colorado Supermax unit reported that after months alone, he stopped speaking entirely, not out of defiance, but because the act felt unnatural. In interviews, he described communication as a muscle that went soft. The behavior the cell shapes. A recurring pattern across dozens of verified studies is the development of ritualistic behavior. Without external structure, people create their own, walking in perfect geometric patterns, whispering the same phrase before sleeping, tapping out made-up rhythms, sorting crumbs into organized lines. Not signs of madness, signs of a mind desperately trying to anchor itself. A Chicago crime lab review quoted an incarcerated man who said, "Your brain needs something to hold on to. If it can't find it, it invents it, when silence becomes the only voice." The most chilling pattern observed by researchers is the moment when a person begins to prefer isolation. Not because it's comfortable, but because the outside world feels overwhelming. People who spend long periods in Supermax units often report panic when reintroduced to normal noise, conversation, or movement. Dr. Haney describes this as institutionalized dissociation, a survival adaptation that becomes a barrier to healthy reintegration. What was once unbearable becomes normal, and what was once normal becomes terrifying. Inside a Supermax cell, identity doesn't disappear all at once. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, until the person who walks out is not the same as the one who walked in. When time stops being time. Researchers studying Supermax units often refer to this stage as temporal distortion, a psychological collapse of the mind's internal clock. It doesn't happen suddenly. It creeps in subtly until hours, days, and weeks begin blending into a single, unmoving blur. According to APA findings and NIJ-reviewed interviews, people in prolonged isolation lose access to nearly all external time markers. No sunrise, no sunset, no schedule determined by conversation, movement, or social interaction. Just uninterrupted sameness. Psychologists say the brain keeps time through change. Without change, time stops feeling real. When days become loops. One man interviewed in a Vera Institute assessment described his routine after several months. Waking up, pacing, lying down, pacing again, without knowing if he was repeating yesterday or starting something new. He said it felt like living inside a photocopy of photocopy. His body still needed rest. His brain simply couldn't tell when. In another NIJ-cited case, an individual reported that he began waking up multiple times a night in panic, convinced he had overslept something, even though there was nothing to oversleep. The absence of structure becomes its own trigger. The collapse of internal rhythm. Sleep cycles are one of the first casualties. Dr. Craig Haney notes that people in long-term segregation frequently develop chronic insomnia, sudden sleep bursts, nighttime hallucination-like sensations, difficulty knowing whether they're dreaming or awake. These experiences mimic the effects recorded in controlled sensory deprivation experiments. But unlike lab subjects, Supermax inmates cannot stop the experiment. A Chicago crime lab review documented one man who said that after a while, sleep felt like blacking out, not resting. He described waking up in the same moment I fell asleep, as if time hadn't passed at all, losing the timeline of your life. Perhaps the most devastating effect is the way isolation erodes the narrative sense of self. People understand their lives as a timeline, a sequence of events with context, meaning, and memory. But when days flatten into sameness, that timeline collapses. One individual in a Colorado Supermax told researchers that he struggled to recall the order of his own childhood events. Not because he forgot them, but because isolation made memories feel unanchored, floating without sequence. It's like trying to stack water, he said. Psychologists call this temporal fragmentation. Inmates call it the drift, when time turns against you. The most unsettling part of this stage is the emotional shift. Once time loses structure, fear begins filling the gaps. Multiple APA-cited interviews describe the same realization. You're not just losing track of days. You're losing track of yourself inside those days. One man put it bluntly. Time was the only thing left inside that cell, and even that turned on me. When identity unravels and time dissolves, the mind reaches a breaking point, one that researchers say can leave permanent, lifelong psychological scars. What happens after this stage is something few people talk about, but every expert warns against. The collapse they can't hide anymore. Inside the most fortified Supermax blocks, a terrifying truth emerges. It's not the walls, the bars, or the armed security that break people. It's the silence. A silence so heavy it begins to occupy the human mind like an intruder you can't fight off. Psychologists call it sensory disorientation, but inmates use a different word, the slow eraser. For one former detainee, the change began with something small. He said he woke up one morning convinced the room was getting narrower by an inch every day. He spent hours tracing the walls with his fingertips, marking imaginary lines, trying to stop something he couldn't see. He later admitted he knew the cell wasn't shrinking, but his mind was. Another man described the silence as a kind of pressure, a loudness inside his own skull that never turned off. After months alone, he started talking to the drain in the floor, convinced it was an opening to the outside world. He said it listened better than people ever did. The real breakthrough came when mental health monitors noticed something chilling in the pattern of collapses. Most inmates weren't breaking because of fear, they were collapsing because of absence. Absence of voices, absence of eye contact, absence of any reminder that they still existed. Even staff couldn't ignore the effect anymore. One retired officer admitted that the quietest tier wasn't peaceful. It was the loudest place in the building, because the human mind tries to fill the silence with anything it can, even if it invents it. Experts warn that the collapse inside Supermax isolation isn't sudden. It is slow, patient, and precise, like dripping water hollowing out stone. And once the erosion starts, it almost never reverses. Supermax isolation was designed for control. Instead, it revealed something far more disturbing. The human mind is not built to live without other humans, and when it is forced to, it begins tearing itself apart just to feel something again. When the mind starts fighting back, after a certain threshold, reported anywhere from 8 to 12 months in verified studies from the National Institute of Justice, APA, and multiple university-led longitudinal reviews, the human mind begins doing something unexpected. It starts trying to adapt to the impossible. Not because the cell becomes easier, but because the brain is wired for survival, even in places built to break it. Researchers call this stage cognitive compensation. Inmates describe it more bluntly. My head had to build a world because the one I was in didn't make sense anymore. The brain's last defense mechanism. Neuroscientists studying long-term isolation have documented a series of mental coping rewires that occur when stimulation hits near zero. The emergence of vivid internal imagery, increased reliance on fantasy or memory loops, the development of rigid routines, the creation of imaginary conversations, heightened emotional reactions to small stimuli. These aren't signs of weakness. They're survival algorithms. A California Department of Corrections psychological review noted that after a year in isolation, many individuals begin to construct internal narratives to maintain coherence. These stories aren't delusions. They're scaffolding. Framework for a mind refusing to collapse. The safe place that isn't safe. One NIJ-verified case involved a man who recreated an entire version of his childhood neighborhood inside his head. He could walk it street by street, store by store. He could visit memories like locations. It kept him grounded. It also became a trap. He later reported that the more detailed his inner world became, the more the real world induced panic. Every time the slot opened for food, my heart would beat like they were ripping me out of someplace I wasn't ready to leave. Psychologists classify this as internal displacement, a protective mechanism that eventually becomes destabilizing. The brain retreats inward for safety, then becomes terrified of coming back out. Imaginary people, real conversations. A phenomenon documented in multiple peer-reviewed forensic psychology studies is the emergence of constructed companions, Not hallucinations, not voices, but imagined people used for mental stability. One Supermax resident described it in a Yale Law School oral history project. I knew he wasn't real, but talking to him felt more natural than talking to myself. Researchers found that these interactions often serve two purposes: regulating emotion, preventing cognitive drift. The mind invents another mind so it doesn't lose its boundaries altogether. The return of the outside world. When the outside world finally does break through, an officer speaking, a cart rolling by, a distant echo, it often hits with painful intensity. Reports from the Federal Bureau of Prisons detail individuals who physically recoil from normal conversation after prolonged solitary time. A simple question, "Are you okay?" can feel intrusive. A sudden noise can feel violent. One inmate described hearing a guard laugh down the hallway after months of silence. It felt like someone threw a rock into a perfectly still lake inside my head. The brain had stabilized itself inside the isolation. Any disruption became destabilizing. When survival becomes its own burden. The most haunting finding across APA and NIJ research is this. The strategies prisoners use to survive isolation become the very same patterns that make reentry, in a population or society, dangerous and overwhelming. Internal worlds replace real ones. Ritual replaces routine. Stillness replaces communication. The mind adapts, but the cost of that adaptation remains long after the door opens. Nothing about this stage is recovery. It's endurance. A mind learning to function under conditions it was never designed to handle. The point of no return. Every long-term Supermax study, from the NIJ, APA, Vera Institute, and International Human Rights Medical Boards, points to a chilling threshold. A moment when the mind doesn't just adapt to isolation. It accepts it, not consciously, not willingly, but biologically. Researchers often call this stage institutionalized isolation syndrome. But the people who lived it use a simpler word: numb, the detachment phase. After months or years in extreme solitude, psychological assessments show a sharp drop in emotional range. Joy becomes muted. Fear becomes constant background noise. Anger becomes unfocused. Sadness becomes unrecognizable. Hope becomes theoretical. The mind stops reacting normally because reacting would burn energy it no longer has. One former federal Supermax resident described it in an ACLU documented interview. "I wasn't happy or sad. I wasn't anything. I felt like a blank sheet of paper people kept writing days on." This isn't apathy. It's cognitive shutdown. The collapse of time. One of the most universally documented effects in Supermax research is temporal disintegration, the breakdown of the brain's ability to track time. Not losing days, losing the feeling of days. Psychologists found that in conditions with zero social interaction and near zero sensory input, the brain stops producing the mental markers that divide one day from another. A man interviewed by the Colorado Department of Corrections research team explained, "I stopped counting the days because they stopped feeling like anything. It was like living inside a long hallway with no doors. Without a timeline, memory drifts. Without memory, identity drifts with it. Emotion without origin. As isolation deepens, many individuals report a strange psychological event. Intense emotion that appears without a trigger. APA reviewed case files list. Sudden waves of guilt. Surges of fear with no cause. Bursts of irritation. Moments of deep sorrow. These feelings come not from events, but from neurological misfires. Orphan emotions without owners. One Supermax interviewee put in plain terms, "Some days I woke up angry and didn't know who I was angry at. Other days I felt grief, but couldn't tell you who I was grieving." In a world with no stimuli, the brain starts creating its own. The quiet breaking point. The public imagines breakdown as violent, screaming, shouting, throwing things. But the real breaking point documented across NIJ and APA research is much quieter. People stop talking, stop asking questions, stop reacting to their environment, Stop believing the world beyond the door matters. It's not surrender. It's exhaustion. One federal mental health clinician described a long-term Supermax patient this way in a DOJ training report. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't loud. He wasn't disruptive. He was just gone. Like the person had eroded, but the body stayed. The final adaptation. The most haunting pattern appears in individuals released from isolation into even small amounts of social contact. Instead of relief, they feel terror. Human presence feels invasive. Conversation feels overwhelming. Eye contact feels unbearable. Freedom feels like chaos. A man in a New York University prison psychology study said, "I didn't know how to be a person around people anymore." The mind had adapted so deeply to isolation that reconnecting required skills it no longer had. This is the point of no return the research warns about. When the brain doesn't just survive Supermax conditions, it rebuilds itself around them. And once that transformation happens, opening the cell door doesn't undo it. It only exposes how much was lost. What the cell leaves behind. After years of isolation, the human mind doesn't return to its original shape. Every major study, from the APA, NJ, and long-term correctional psychology reviews, confirms the same outcome. You don't walk out of a Supermax cell. You carry it with you. For many, the world becomes too loud, too bright, too unpredictable. A man interviewed in a Vera Institute follow-up described release this way. It felt like stepping out of a cave and realizing the sun wasn't warm anymore. Some struggle with crowds. Some fear eye contact. Some can't sleep unless the room is silent and still. Conditions that remind them of the very place that broke them. The isolation ends, but the effects don't. Supermax creates scars you can't see, but the people who live through it feel them every single day. The part they don't want you to think about. If you've reached this point, you already understand something most people don't. Solitary confinement isn't just a punishment. It's a psychological experiment happening in real time. One that millions of viewers never hear the truth about. And if we don't talk about it, it stays hidden, buried, ignored. So if this documentary opened your eyes, hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because the more people who see this, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend these cells don't exist. Your engagement helps this story reach the world. And there are more truths coming that they never want exposed. See you in the next episode.